Good afternoon. This is David Friedman. I'm your co-host for TCA Crossroads, where entrepreneurs and investors connect. With me is Dave Berkus, TCA Chairman Emeritus. How are you today?
I am doing fine, David. It's a pleasure to be your co-host at that.
I'm so happy to hear that. You know, getting a co-host is hard. At least I'm having a hard time keeping them, it seems. But
Yeah, it might
I'm
last
looking
only a
forward
week.
to this. Um,
Okay.
so, so today I'm going to put you on the spot, just like you did the last time to me. We're going to ask you about something that's near and dear to our heart as investors, also for the entrepreneur. We're going to
Right.
talk about exits. What makes a good exit? What should we as entrepreneurs look for in an exit? How do we determine the right exit? Should it be an IPO, a merger? Should it be a SPAC? Should it be, hopefully not, but a liquidation? We've seen that, unfortunately. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I'm going to ask you questions as you present. Would that be all right?
That would do it for me.
All right. So we're going to turn it over to you right now.
All right. Well, we're going to call this way to the exit. And it's all about the entrepreneur and the investors preparing for and proactively adding exit value. There's a big difference between an exit that happens just by accident when somebody calls and says, I want to buy you, and planning for it in advance. So there are 6 steps, and we're going to very quickly go through them. First of all, we've got to know that we can maximize the exit price because strategic bidders are going to bid more money and they will buy earlier. And so the more they pay, the more they value the team and not just the net earnings of a company. And so we've often said that we are, as we invest, focusing on the team almost more than the idea. And if that team is coachable and flexible, we win. But at the exit, we need to know that that team is with us. So the clout that that team has in post-sale value, I can't begin to emphasize enough. And it's likely that the team will be added to and not cut when a good strategic investor comes along. So before we talk about these steps, there is the curse of knowledge. We often overlook what the team does because we take it for granted. Here's a quote. If someone decided to enter our business today, how long would it take them to achieve our level of momentum? Big question. And there's value added when the person is, or the company is ahead of everybody else. So here come the steps. Number 1, take inventory. What are your assets strategically? That is the IP, the trade secrets, the processes. What are your core capabilities? What's your team do best? Is it sales? Is it design? Is it programming? What is it? Maybe it could be something like you have a bigger market share of a broader market. Step 2, how about those emotional bidders I keep coming back to, or strategic bidders? When you find an emotional bidder, which I did for my business, it's unlikely to occur, but boy, when it happens, um, an emotional bidder, I've got to define. And then, David, if you've ever had one of these, you can kind of smile. That company, that CEO is desperate because there may be external threats. You might be stealing their customers. There might be internal threats. Their new product rollout was a thud, or they may be having the problem of aging products where they're losing users. Have you ever had this happen to you before, David, in this kind of a thing where you've seen a bidder for a company that bid higher than you thought?
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting. I mean, there's obviously the external threat, but I just want to point out one external threat that happens. Let's say that there are several companies in that business. They want to preclude a competitor from getting an edge. So there's an
Yes.
emotional reason to take on a company to stop another company, even if that either they want to stop the company from getting the people, or they don't want to let that technology out, or to prevent, you know, to your point, the thud. So yeah, I've seen it before. I've heard it before, not only in the startup world, but also in the corporate world.
Very good. I wanted to point that out because an emotional buyer is what you want, but that's like what? A blue, red, and white bird that happens to fly and land on your shoulder. It just doesn't happen very often. Step 3 is identify potential strategic bidders, and those are the ones that we're looking for. Don't focus on either their ability or willingness to acquire you quite yet. We'll get to that. You can never target bidders you haven't considered. So therefore, be expansive. Think of all the possible strategic bidders that could be a fit. And I'll give you a little bit of a matrix to do that in a minute. But the real question you have to ask is who makes money when our venture makes money and who makes less money when we succeed? These are the strategic bidders that you're going to be looking for. Step 4 out of 6, pick 5 target strategic bidders. These are people that you believe have the ability to pay your target price. They can access credit where you might not. They can have average deal sizes that are larger than your deal. And then there's a big question, and this is one that most people don't think of. If you're more than 19%, meaning 20% of their revenues, they have to take your income into their income statement. They've got to audit you. They've got to combine you in a consolidated statement. That's going to cost them money and time. If you are 19% or less, as you will be for most buyers, then you're just a piece on their balance sheet. Big difference to those bean counters in their company and to the costs. What is their willingness to bid? Do they have a dedicated M&A team? I always like it when there is because it's a very much more professional purchase. And have they recently lost another deal? We just had a big one with that, with one of my companies. We spent a lot of money in legal, and the company withdrew. They had made a very big offer that was worth a lot of money. They withdrew at the last second after we had spent all this money getting ready to close. And then we discovered that they had lost a lot of other deals. They were out there shopping, and they were willing to do this. And do they have a despised arch rival or two? Because if they do, that makes you a great candidate to help them.
Yep.
Step 5, track target strategic buyers, monitor for each of them, their acquisitions, their press releases, their stock price, the analyst reports. This isn't hard to do because most of these are public companies. Do we have any ties with their directors? And then there should be some progress meetings. Their internal champions, whoever you've identified, should support making the bid. And then at this point, learning who the real decision makers are. Fill in that organization chart so that you know who you should approach and who they, in turn, within their organization should approach as well. And step 6 is select investment bankers or an investment banker. Hold a contest. Have each of 3 strategic bankers present to you and figure out which ones know more about your industry, which ones are more compatible, which ones aren't going to overcharge a fee at the beginning, as some of them do. So find one with industry experience, create the right questions to be ready to ask to all 3 if those are the 3 that you pick. And then your board makes the final interview and decides the final or best banker. So 2 is just for you to understand that we reverse engineer the exit to make it right. So to achieve outside returns, we look for frothy market conditions. And by the way, depending on when you're watching this podcast, in 2004, that frothy market condition has not happened for about 1.5 years. It's going to happen again, I believe, by the end of 2024. And so therefore, it's not wrong to participate now in getting ready, doing all the things you have to do. And one of the things you have to do is to list and therefore later on attract multiple bidders. It's a disciplined process, and advisors know how to manage, especially in their experience in your vertical. And then the preparation for due diligence. I am working with one of my companies right now. It took a month to put together a data room, which is an electronic data room on Box or on Dropbox or on any one of many of the various places you can. And once you have done that, it is a combination of all of your contracts, everything from your articles or designation of incorporation through all the documents, including board meetings, that allow someone to do due diligence. If you do that first, the acquisition will take a month less time, kind of a guarantee. Dave, have you had to go through these kinds of things before? Is this resonating in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I've had to do it when I was in the corporate world when we were buying companies. I remember with one of the startups that I was involved in the cyber market, and we had a big company buy. They had this. It was frothy. It was the cyber world. A lot of need for cybersecurity type applications. Large company came in with just more people than we had in the organization, actually. But it was
Uh-huh.
also, I want to raise something, and maybe you can, in achieving outsized returns. When we look at that concept of getting these high returns, it affects two things, and maybe you'll cover it. Number one is the initial valuation that you pay as an investor, and number
Yep.
one, the market conditions and the timing of certain kind of high profile type products. For example, today, AI, you say, my
Right.
company is petrocks.ai, and you say, wow, we can get a higher return. So can you talk about how valuations affect the exit from both the investor and the entrepreneur side, and what happens with certain market conditions? But those are the things that I think will affect both sides.
I'm going to touch on that today, but we're going to have a separate Crossroads edition based upon that very thing. And you're
Okay.
right. There is a range, for example, for SaaS companies, not talking about a vertical yet, just SaaS companies, because of their recurring revenues. And that range has varied from frothy times up to an average of 12 times revenues, down to today, an average of 6 to 8 times revenues. And that's why I said these aren't the right times. And one of the things you're going to do is prepare for those right times if you're looking for the maximum price. Okay, so what's the textbook version of an M&A process? Well, I'm not going to go into detail, but typical sales process timeline is pretty long. You can get that from a slide without even reading this. And there are lots of stages to it. But really, what this whole process looks like for the average entrepreneur that isn't prepared is this. The CEO gets a phone call and,
Yeah.
oh my God, what do I do? I'll get the board together, which, by the way, is required. I will try and respond. Well, maybe I won't respond now. Well, maybe I'll see what I can do. Or maybe it's time to hire an investment banker. You get the idea. The CEO doesn't want to get this phone call. This needs to be something that we plan for in advance. That leads to a suboptimal process, and a suboptimal process leads to a suboptimal price. So let's not do that. Let's create exit optionality. The reactionary exit that I just kind of described with those faces of those CEOs, all kinds of negatives. You can see them on the left-hand side, and I won't go into them. But let's call this a smart money exit, where you identify the bidders earlier and you establish visibility and you build relationships. And the things that I first talked about in those 6 steps, it creates exit optionality. And the result will always be a better exit at a higher price. And by the way, a more organized exit at that. So the last thing to tell you is a goal without a plan is just a wish. And the harder I work, the luckier I get. And I'm going to stop the presentation to allow us to discuss it right here. But I hope I gave you enough to think about. Pre-planning is everything. And if you
Yeah.
don't, the opportunity to make a lot of money out of the business that you've built with such effort, especially for the investors that have waited for so long, is much less. So this is important. And I really want you to take away from this. Planning is everything. The data room can be done long before you go for the run and just kept up every time there's a new document you need to add. And investment bankers always add value to a deal. David?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Wayne Gretzky, and Wayne Gretzky always said, "I skate to where the puck is going
Yep.
and not to where it's been." So, should the entrepreneur think about the exit plan when he first approaches the angel or at a growth stage? And I have a follow-up question on that one as well for a financial reason. But when should the entrepreneur think about exit planning? And then I want to flip it and then say, where does the angel investor or investor want to have that exit consideration discussed?
Well, we all know, and I think you alluded to it even before I began this little presentation, is that the angels are going to ask the entrepreneur, what are your plans for an exit? Because taking money from any outside source, and I don't include mom here, but taking money from any outside source means you're making a promise that you're sometime going to either sell or, if you're lucky, go through an IPO, but that's an exit too. So the answer is the angels or the investors will force the question, but the entrepreneur better have thought about it in advance. The opposite is a lifestyle business. I have been trapped, maybe you have too, in lifestyle businesses where there was no exit. And there are times when I've had to force exits in companies. That's been very uncomfortable. But I have some stories, not to tell today because we haven't got enough time, but they're excellent stories and they involve some famous names. But forcing exits is not a good thing. It means that the entrepreneur wasn't prepared. Or another thing that happens is sometimes the entrepreneur makes enough money because the board allowed the entrepreneur to make enough money from salary and payments and whatever else that the entrepreneur is pretty comfortable and in control. So,
well, let me ask a follow-up question a little different way. There's a qualified small business federal ruling. So if I invest as an investor and keep a company for 5, and the company is in existence for 5 years, once I own stock, okay, it's a 1202 ruling. How important is that? It's a loaded question, by the way, obviously.
Yeah, I'm ready for the answer.
Yeah, I know. So how important is that for the investor? And how important is it for the entrepreneur to understand the investor's psychology? Because I keep hearing from, and I'm sure you've had this, well, if we find somebody really interested, we'll exit at 3 years. And I'm saying to myself, I don't want to see that. So can you talk about 1202, what the effect is on both sides?
So there are two halves of this little equation. Q qualified business stock, QSBS, qualified small business stock, is what we're talking about. That's Rule 1202. You're right on the 5-year limit. It has to be a C corporation. It can't be an LLC. It can't be an S corp, but that's fine. Most of our investments are C corps. And it can't be in the finance industry. It can't be a bank. So we have to be careful about that. And there are a couple of other rules too. This is one you love. If you make more than $10 million, it's capped at $10 million, but I'd be happy to make $10 million on an investment. This is per individual.
At my stage, I'm okay with that now. Maybe 10 years ago, maybe not, but I'm fine with it. Most of us would be.
Okay, so that's the plus side of all of this is the QSBS. We like to have that. The minus side is the internal rate of return. I had a deal where I was able to join an early round, very early, but I got in because I wanted to get into a round that I thought was really frothy. And I invested $100,000 and got out of it 16 months later with a 3x return, was it? Or was it a 4x return? Whatever it was. That IRR, let's turn it down to 2 years and 400%, just make it easy. That's a 200% IRR. And if you're talking about a target of 21%, you could be happy with a 2-year return until you see your tax bill and have to pay 30%. The other half of this is if you live in California, the QSBS doesn't work because they have over the years eliminated it in steps, unfortunately, which made us more angry every time they did it. And now we're taxed at ordinary income tax rates, no matter whether it was a month or 25 years before you finally got out of it. So federal income tax, ordinarily higher than state income tax. And yes, you're right. We like it to be timed right after 5 years. We, the Tech Coast Angels, just exited from DTX. We had $1 billion exit, 500 million in cash, and 500 million is waiting for a little FDA approvals, as I understand it. I'm not quite exactly sure. And so the cash came in months before the 5-year limit. Would we have loved to have waited just a couple of more months? Well, sure. But we had no control. We were a small part of the 500 million, unfortunately. Yeah. But sometimes you just really don't drive the bus. So David, Green Dot turned out to have been a finance company. And you mentioned it a minute ago, but it turns out that Green Dot did not give us QSBS stock because it was one of those limited excursions that you weren't allowed, where you were excluded from getting it. Now, we all happily paid our income tax, but that was the deal.
Any final words you want to leave with the audience?
This whole thing that we've discussed today is real value, which you can create if you do this right. And I'd hate to leave money on the table because you, the entrepreneur, or you, the angel, did it wrong. So I want you to take from this presentation that doing it right is worth a lot of money in your pocket when the exit finally comes.
All right. Well, that's a wrap. Really appreciate you sharing what we should look for, both as investors and as entrepreneurs on an exit. Begin with the end in mind is my thinking. It's Stephen Covey's thinking, and that's exactly the way both parties need to look at it. For TCA Venture Group, I'm David Friedman with my co-host Dave Berkus. Check us out on Spotify, Apple. Watch us on YouTube. Send us comments. Sign up, subscribe, and have a great day.